When a dying billionaire disguises himself as a janitor to see his restaurant one last time, the heartbreaking scene he discovers in the back alley leaves him completely shattered. Before we dive into the story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment where in the world you are watching from. Damon, the CEO, sat in the sterile silence of his penthouse office, the panoramic view of the city offering no comfort against the chill settling in his bones. Dr. Aris, the specialist, sat opposite him, his expression professional but grim, delivering the verdict that would shatter Damon's world: advanced cardiac fibrosis. It sounded clinical, detached, but the reality was brutal. His heart was turning to stone, stiffening until it would refuse to beat. 30 days. That was the timeline. No surgeries, no experimental drugs, just 1 month of waning strength before the inevitable end. Damon looked at his hands, the hands that had built a billion-dollar empire, feeling utterly powerless. Dr. Aris spoke of palliative care, of making final arrangements, but Damon heard only the ticking of a clock that had suddenly grown deafeningly loud. He dismissed the specialist with a wave of his hand, needing to be alone with his mortality. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling mirror, staring at the man in the $5,000 suit, the golden boy of the culinary world, the genius CEO, the man who had everything. It all felt like a costume now, a hollow shell protecting a dying organ. He hated it. With a sudden burst of frustration, he tore off his silk tie and threw it across the room. He needed to escape this tower, to see the world as it truly was before he left it. He went to the back of his closet, digging out a box he had not touched in years. Inside were scuffed work boots and a faded red flannel shirt, remnants of a life before the wealth consumed him. He dressed quickly, the rough fabric feeling grounding against his skin. He caught his reflection again, Dan the drifter, a nobody. Perfect. He grabbed a beanie to cover his styled hair and slipped out the service elevator, bypassing his security detail entirely. The destination was clear in his mind: the Velvet Room, his flagship restaurant, the jewel in his crown. He needed to see it, not as the owner whom everyone feared, but as a ghost haunting his own creation. A 20-minute taxi ride later, he stood outside the familiar glass doors. The bright neon sign buzzed overhead, a beacon of luxury. But as he stepped inside, the grand illusion cracked. It was a Tuesday night, yet customers stood waiting in the foyer with no host in sight. He moved deeper into the dining room, his eyes scanning for perfection but finding only neglect. Tables remained uncleared, covered in half-eaten appetizers and crumpled napkins. A smell of burning oil drifted from the kitchen, a safety hazard that should have triggered alarms. In the corner, leaning casually against the mahogany bar, stood Rick, the manager. Instead of managing the chaos, Rick was laughing loudly, flirting shamelessly with a hostess while sipping a glass of the most expensive wine. He had his back turned to a distressed family trying to flag him down for the check. Damon felt a surge of rage, a spike in his blood pressure that his weak heart protested against. This was his entire legacy, rotting from the inside out. He pulled his beanie lower, gripping a dirty mop bucket he found near the service station to blend in, and watched the disaster unfold. Damon, the CEO, tightened his grip on the rough wooden mop handle as he observed the pandemonium swirling around him. Amidst the sea of lazy staff members and neglected patrons, one solitary figure stood out like a beacon of pure competence. Sophie, the waitress, was everywhere at once, sprinting between tables with a quiet desperation that bordered on panic. She refilled water glasses that others had ignored, wiped down dirty surfaces, and apologized profusely to angry diners for delays she had not caused. Her uniform was stained with sweat, but her smile never wavered when facing a customer. Suddenly, The sharp crash of shattering glass silenced the room. A clumsy busboy had dropped a tray near the kitchen, but Rick the manager descended on Sophie instead. Damon watched in total disbelief as Rick the manager berated her loudly in front of the entire dining room, accusing her of clumsiness and loudly announcing he was docking her pay on the spot. Sophie did not argue or fight back. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and dropped to her knees to pick up the jagged shards with her bare hands. The injustice made Damon's chest ache with a sharp pain that had nothing to do with his failing heart. He remained in the shadows until the last customer finally left and the lights dimmed. It was past 1 in the morning when he slipped out the back exit into the cool night air. He intended to leave, but a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a soft, jagged sobbing coming from behind the metal dumpsters. Damon moved quietly toward the noise, his heavy boots scraping against the pavement. In the dim yellow light of a flickering street lamp, he found her. Sophie the waitress sat huddled on an overturned plastic milk crate, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept. In her trembling hands, she clutched a handful of crumpled $1 bills and a piece of paper that looked terrifyingly official. Damon squinted to see the bold red letters stamped across the top of the document. It was a final eviction notice. She was counting the meager money over and over again, her voice cracking as she whispered the total, coming up short every single time. The sight of her raw despair froze him in place. This was not just a bad work shift. This was a woman on the edge of losing everything. Damon stood there, the billionaire disguised as a janitor, realizing that while his time was running out, hers was crashing down around her right now. Damon the CEO stood frozen in the damp shadows of the alleyway, the cold wind biting through the thin fabric of his flannel shirt, though the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. He watched Sophie the waitress, a woman he had seen managing chaos with grace only an hour before, now reduced to a trembling silhouette against the brick wall. Her sobbing was a quiet, jagged sound that tore at the silence of the night. He hesitated, his instinct as a corporate titan telling him to turn away, to respect the privacy of strangers, to remain the detached observer he had intended to be. But the human part of him, the part that was slowly waking up as his body shut down, refused to leave. He took a tentative step forward, his heavy work boots scraping loudly against the wet pavement. Sophie gasped, her head snapping up in terror as she frantically tried to shove the crumpled paper and dollar bills into her apron pocket. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek, and tried to compose herself into the smiling server she was paid to be. Damon raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, keeping his voice low and gravelly, adopting the persona of Dan the Drifter. He told her he was just the janitor, and asked if she was all right. Sophie let out a shaky breath, clearly relieved he was not a threat, but her guard remained up. She tried to laugh, a brittle sound that cracked in the middle, and claimed it was just allergies, just a long shift, just nothing. Damon did not buy it. He moved closer, leaning against a stack of wooden pallets, and pointed gently to the pocket where she had hidden the letter. He asked her not to lie to him, telling her that he knew what bad news looked like because he had seen enough of it in his time. Something about his calm demeanor, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion of carrying her burden alone, made Sophie crumble. She pulled the paper back out, smoothing the wrinkles against her knee. It was an eviction notice, stark and final. She began to speak, the words spilling out in a torrent of repressed anxiety. She explained that her landlord had raised the rent on their small 2-bedroom apartment by 20% without warning. She had tried to pick up extra shifts, tried to cut corners on groceries, tried to sell some of her old clothes, but it was not enough. She was short exactly $800, and the deadline was tomorrow at noon. If she did not pay, the process to remove them would begin. Damon listened, his heart aching. $800. It was a pathetic sum to him. He had tipped concierges more than that for getting him theater tickets. He had spent more than that on a single bottle of vintage scotch that he did not even finish. Yet here was this woman, sitting on a milk crate in a freezing alley, her entire life unraveling over an amount he would not even notice missing from his bank account. He asked her why she could not just move to a cheaper place. Sophie looked at him with wide, desperate eyes and shook her head. She explained about Toby, her younger brother. She told Damon that Toby was 16 years old and bound to a wheelchair due to a degenerative muscular condition. Their current apartment was on the ground floor. It had a ramp. The bathroom had been retrofitted with grab bars that she had installed herself. Moving was not just an inconvenience, it was an impossibility. Finding another accessible unit in this city within their budget would take months, time they did not have. If they were evicted, Toby would have nowhere to go. They would be in a shelter, separated, or on the streets. The thought of her vulnerable brother sleeping in a shelter broke her composure completely, and she buried her face in her hands again. Damon felt the weight of the cash roll in his jeans pocket. He had withdrawn $3,000 earlier that day, intending to use it for bribes or emergencies during his undercover experiment. He fingered the thick wad of bills, his mind racing. He could not just hand her the money as a billionaire. It would blow his cover and potentially humiliate her. He needed a story. He needed a lie that would allow her to keep her dignity. He cleared his throat and reached into his pocket, pulling out the cash. He told her to look at him. Sophie looked up, confused. Damon peeled off exactly $800, plus an extra $100 for good measure. He held it out to her, his hand steady. When she stared at him in shock, asking what he was doing, he spun the lie. He told her that he was an old man with simple needs and too much luck. He claimed he had bought a scratch-off lottery ticket at the gas station down the street earlier that evening. He said he had won $1,000. He told her he had no family, no debts, and nothing to spend it on but booze and cigarettes, which his doctor said he should quit anyway. He pressed the money into her trembling hand, insisting that it was not charity, but simply passing on a bit of luck from one soul to another. Sophie looked from the money to his face, searching for a catch. She tried to give it back, saying she could not take his winnings, that it was too much. Damon closed her fingers around the bills. He told her to take it for Toby. He told her to keep the apartment so her brother would be safe. Tears spilled fresh from her eyes, but these were different tears of overwhelming relief. She gripped his hand, her fingers cold against his skin, and whispered a thank you that seemed to come from the very center of her being. For the first time in weeks, Damon felt a sensation in his chest that was not pain. It was a warm, rhythmic thumping. His dying heart, usually a source of dread, was beating with a purpose. He had saved her. With a simple lie and a handful of paper, he had saved her world. Damon stormed into his penthouse suite, the oppressive silence of the luxury apartment mocking the raw, vibrant emotion of the alleyway he had just left. He stripped off the flannel shirt, throwing it onto the Italian leather sofa, and marched straight to his secure telephone line. It was 3 in the morning, but billionaires like him did not wait for standard business hours. He dialed the head of his legal department, waking the man instantly. Damon spoke with a voice like cracked ice as he issued the command to terminate Rick the manager immediately. He cited wage theft, safety violations, and gross negligence, ordering a full forensic audit of the payroll at the Velvet Room going back 5 years. He wanted Rick destroyed professionally, his reputation incinerated so thoroughly he would never manage a simple lemonade stand again. The call ended with a sharp click, and for a moment the vengeance felt sweet, a clean, surgical strike against the cancer rotting his company. But as the adrenaline faded, the silence returned. Damon sat at his massive mahogany desk, the heavy checkbook lying open before him. He uncapped his fountain pen, the ink black and permanent. With a trembling hand, he wrote Sophie the waitress's name on the payee line. He filled in the amount field with a sum that would cover her rent for 10 years. He could buy the entire building she lived in with a single phone call. He could erase every struggle she had ever known before the sun came up. He stared at the check, imagining her face when she received it. She would be grateful, certainly, but then the wall would go up. She would see him as a benefactor, a distant savior, a god descending from Olympus, not a friend. She would never look at Dan the Drifter with that same unguarded vulnerability again. The connection they had shared in the dark alley would be severed by the crushing weight of his wealth. Damon felt a sharp pang in his chest, his dying heart yearning for something money simply could not buy. Slowly, deliberately, he ripped the check in half. He dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. He would save her, yes, but he would do it as a man, not an institution. He needed her to know him, really know him, before the end finally came to claim him forever. The air inside the velvet room had changed completely, shifting from the frantic, sweat-soaked desperation of the previous visit to a calm, rhythmic hum of efficiency. Damon, the CEO, pulled the brim of his wool beanie lower over his ears as he stepped through the glass doors, once again assuming the persona of Dan the Drifter. He half expected to hear the booming, abusive voice of Rick the manager echoing off the mahogany walls, but there was only the soft clinking of silverware and the low murmur of satisfied diners. The toxicity had been scrubbed away as thoroughly as the grease stains he had seen earlier. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, keeping his head down, trying to make himself invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option with her. Sophie the waitress spotted him almost immediately from across the dining room. Her face, which had been drawn and gray with exhaustion just 48 hours ago, now held a glow that stopped Damon's heart in his chest. She practically skipped over to him, balancing a tray with a grace that seemed effortless now that the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. She set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him before he could even order, her eyes dancing with a secret delight. She leaned in close, whispering conspiratorially that the tyrant was gone. She told Damon that corporate security had marched Rick the manager out of the building that very morning, carrying a box of his personal effects while the entire kitchen staff tried not to applaud. She called it a miracle, a stroke of divine intervention that had saved them all. Damon forced a smile, burying his guilt under a sip of black coffee. He knew exactly how divine that intervention had been, having signed the termination paperwork himself, but to her it was just magic. Then she slid a plate across the polished wood. It was a slice of deep-dish apple pie, warm and smelling of cinnamon and comfort. When Damon reached for his wallet, Sophie stopped him with a gentle hand on his forearm. She told him it was on her. She insisted that he was her lucky charm, that ever since he gave her that scratch-off money, everything had turned around. The eviction was paid, the bad boss was gone, and she finally felt like she could breathe again. Damon looked at the pie, feeling unworthy of her kindness. He was a fraud, eating pastry paid for by a woman who counted every penny. He stayed until the restaurant began to clear out, and the lights were dimmed for closing. He knew he should leave, go back to his penthouse, and wait for his heart to fail in peace. But the thought of the silent, cold apartment was unbearable compared to the warmth radiating from Sophie. As she untied her apron and clocked out, Damon found himself standing up, his palms sweating in a way they never did during boardroom negotiations. He waited for her by the door, feeling like a nervous teenager rather than a dying billionaire. When she emerged, buttoning her coat against the chill, he cleared his dry throat. He asked her what she was doing now. Sophie looked surprised, checking her watch. Damon pushed forward. He asked if she ate yet. He suggested a burger at the cheap all-night diner down the street. Nothing fancy, just grease and conversation. Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering over her car keys. She bit her lip, looking at him, assessing the man she thought was a lonely drifter. She saw loneliness that matched her own. Slowly, her expression softened. She admitted that she could really use a friend right now. She agreed to 1 hour, just 1 single hour. Damon let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. 1 hour was all he had asked for, but as they walked out into the cool night air together, he knew he would trade every remaining minute of his life just to make that hour last forever. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner hummed with a low buzz that matched the vibration in Damon the CEO's chest, though for once, the sensation was not pain, but anticipation. He sat across from Sophie the waitress in a booth taped together with silver duct tape, watching her dip a fry into a puddle of ketchup. It was the best meal he had eaten in a decade. Sophie was midway through a story about Toby the brother, her face animated in a way that made her look 5 years younger than she had in the alleyway. She described Toby not as an invalid, but as a prodigy trapped in a failing body. She told Damon that her brother was 16 years old and could replicate any melody he heard on the radio after a single listen, despite his fingers curling with spasticity. She spoke of the sacrifices she made, the skipped meals, the lost college credits, the double shifts, not with resentment, but with a fierce, protective pride that humbled Damon to his core. He sat there, a man who had built skyscrapers but no home, realizing he was the poorest person at the table. The urge to confess nearly choked him. He looked at her kind eyes and felt a desperate need to strip away the flannel shirt and the lie. He wanted to tell her that he could fly Toby to Zurich for the best specialists in the world. He wanted to tell her that he was terrified of the silence waiting for him in his penthouse. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, and told her that he was not who she thought he was. Sophie paused, a fry halfway to her mouth, her expression shifting to concern. She asked if he was in trouble with the law. The innocence of the question broke his resolve. He could not ruin this. He forced a smile and lied, saying he was just a man with a lot of regrets. Later, alone in the velvet darkness of his limousine, reality came crashing back in the form of a phone call. Dr. Aris, the specialist, was on the line, his tone urgent and hopeful. He had secured a spot for Damon in a clinical trial for a left ventricular assist device. It was a mechanical pump that would take over the beating of his heart. It would require open-heart surgery, weeks of recovery in the ICU, and a permanent cable exiting his abdomen connected to a battery pack. But, the doctor insisted, it could buy him 6 months, maybe even 12. Damon stared out the tinted window at the city passing by. He imagined spending his last week sedated, intubated, and tethered to a machine, trading the vibrancy of Sophie's laughter for the rhythmic whoosh of a turbine in his chest. He would be alive, technically, but he would be a prisoner. He thought of the burger grease on his fingers and the warmth of Sophie's hand when they said goodbye. He realized that 1 month of feeling this way was worth more than a century of pumping blood through a cold machine. He cut Dr. Aris off mid-sentence. He kept his voice steady as he refused the surgery. The doctor protested, calling it suicide, but Damon corrected him. He said it was not suicide. It was finally deciding to live. He ended the call and powered off the phone, severing the lifeline to his wealth and his sickness, choosing instead to drive back toward the neighborhood where a waitress and a boy in a wheelchair were sleeping, the only place on earth where his dying heart felt like it was actually beating. The sleek black smartphone vibrated against the polished mahogany surface of the boardroom table, a tiny rebellion against the suffocating atmosphere of corporate seriousness that filled the air. Damon, the CEO, sat at the head of the colossal table, flanked by 12 vice presidents who were droning on endlessly about quarterly projections for the Asian market. Usually, he would be grilling them on profit margins and efficiency, but today, his focus was entirely on the screen hidden discreetly behind his crystal water glass. A message lit up the glass, accompanied by a pixelated picture of a cat stuck in a set of window blinds with the caption, "Me trying to get through this shift without killing the new guy." Damon snorted. A sharp, uncharacteristic sound that cut through the drone of the presentation like a gunshot. The room fell into a terrified silence. The chief financial officer froze mid-sentence, looking pale and terrified that he had offended the boss. Damon waved a hand dismissively, covering his mouth to hide the grin spreading across his face. He typed back a quick response under the table, asking if the cat needed a rescue team or just a better escape plan. This had become his new reality, a secret digital lifeline tethering him to the world of the living while he sat in the waiting room of the dead. Over the next 5 days, their correspondence became a rapid-fire exchange of mundane intimacies that meant more to him than any billion-dollar merger he had ever closed. At dawn, he would wake up not to the dread of his terminal diagnosis, but to a notification from Sophie the waitress wishing him a good morning with a bright sun emoji. At lunch, while he ate flavorless health food prepared by his private chef to protect his failing heart, she would send him photos of the greasy, delicious specials at the diner where they had eaten. He lived for these vibrations in his pocket. They were the artificial heartbeat his own body was failing to provide. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling review of the company's real estate assets, his phone buzzed with a different kind of message. It was not a joke or a meme. It was a question that made his breath hitch in his throat. Sophie had typed that she told Toby about the nice janitor who helped them with the rent. She said Toby wanted to meet the man who saved their apartment. She asked if he would come over for dinner on Tuesday night. Damon stared at the text, the cursor blinking like a warning light. Meeting the brother was a massive threshold. It was stepping out of the neutral ground of coffee shops and diners and into the sanctuary of their private home. It was dangerous. It increased the risk of his true identity being discovered exponentially. His suit, his watch, his shoes, everything he owned screamed wealth. To go into their home meant shedding every last remnant of Damon the CEO and fully inhabiting the lie of Dan the Drifter. It was a deception that felt cruel to maintain, but impossible to abandon. He looked at the executives arguing over percentage points, men who would replace him within a week of his funeral. Then he looked at the phone, at the invitation to a cramped apartment with a wheelchair ramp and a struggling waitress. The choice was agonizingly simple. He typed his reply with shaking fingers, ignoring the tremor that was becoming more frequent in his hands. He told her he would be honored to meet Toby. He told her he would bring dessert. He locked the phone and placed it face down, the black screen reflecting the face of a dying man who had finally found a reason to survive until Tuesday. Damon, the CEO, stood outside the peeling green door of apartment 4B, clutching a white bakery box tied with string as if it were a shield against the inevitable exposure of his soul. He had traded his Italian leather loafers for the scuffed work boots again, but beneath the flannel shirt, his heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm that had nothing to do with his medical condition and everything to do with the terror of being known. He knocked 3 times, the sound hollow in the drafty corridor. The door swung open to reveal Sophie the waitress, wearing a faded, oversized sweater and a smile that lit up the dimly lit hallway. She ushered him inside, and the warmth of the tiny apartment hit him instantly, smelling of roasted chicken and lemon polish. It was a space defined by its limitations. The hallway was scarred from wheelchair tires, and the living room was dominated by medical equipment that hummed softly in the corner. Yet, in the center of the cramped room sat the heart of the home, a battered, second-hand electronic keyboard resting on a stack of encyclopedias. Behind it sat Toby the brother. At 16 years old, Toby was skeletal, his body twisted by the cruelty of his condition, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and fiercely protective as they locked onto Damon. This was the gatekeeper. Damon stepped forward, introducing himself as Dan, the man who cleaned floors, trying to shrink his imposing presence to fit the humble surroundings. Toby studied him for a long, agonizing minute, looking for pity or deceit, but finding neither in Damon's tired face. Then, with a jerky nod of his head, Toby gestured to the plastic keys. It was a challenge. Sophie laughed nervously, explaining that Toby spoke better through keys than words. Damon hesitated. He had not touched a piano in 20 years, not since his mother died, but his hands remembered. He sat on the mismatched stool, his knees bumping against the plastic casing. He played a single C major chord, tentative and soft. Toby immediately countered with a complex, jazz-infused riff that demanded a response. Damon smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, and began to play. They traded measures, a call and response that built from a clumsy conversation into a soaring duet of blues and improvisation. For 10 minutes, the billionaire and the boy spoke a language that required no lies, their fingers dancing over the keys in a synchronized blur that filled the small room with a symphony of connection. When the final note faded into the hum of the refrigerator, Toby grinned, a crooked, beautiful expression that transformed his face. He told Damon that he was not bad for a janitor. Sophie clapped from the kitchen doorway, tears shining in her eyes, declaring dinner served. The meal was simple roast chicken and mashed potatoes, but to Damon, eating off a chipped plate with a mismatched fork, it tasted better than the Michelin-starred meals he usually picked at alone. After dinner, Sophie excused herself to the kitchen to brew tea, leaving the two males alone in the fading light of the living room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Toby watched Damon with a renewed intensity, his earlier playfulness replaced by a serious, piercing gaze that seemed to strip away the flannel disguise. He told Damon quietly that he knew the shoes were expensive. He pointed out that no janitor wore boots with soles that had never seen a mop bucket. Damon froze, his blood running cold. He had been careless. He looked at the boy, realizing that Toby's physical limitations had honed his observation skills to a razor's edge. Damon leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper so low it barely carried over the sound of the kettle whistling in the next room. He admitted the truth, or at least part of it. He told Toby that he was not a janitor, but a man who had made a lot of money and realized too late that it brought him nothing but loneliness. He looked at the cramped room, at the ramp that took up half the floor, at the talent trapped in a broken body. He made a vow then, locking eyes with the boy. He whispered that he was going to buy them a house. Not just any house, but one with wide hallways, a roll-in shower, and a soundproof music studio with a baby grand piano right in the center, facing a window that looked out on a garden. Toby's eyes widened, disbelief warring with hope. Damon reached out, gripping the boy's thin shoulder. He swore it was true, but he needed a favor. He needed Toby to keep the secret just a little longer. He promised that the deed would be in the mail before the month was out, but Sophie could not know yet. She was too proud, too noble. She would refuse it if she thought it was charity. It had to be a surprise. Toby looked at the kitchen door, then back at Damon. He saw the desperation in the older man's eyes, the look of someone trying to balance the scales of the universe before the clock ran out. Slowly, Toby extended a twisted pinky finger, a pinky swear. The most binding contract in the world. Damon hooked his own finger around it, sealing the pact. In that moment, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of cheap tea, Damon the CEO felt a surge of purpose so powerful it almost stopped his heart right then and there. He had an ally. He had a mission. And for the first time in his life, he had a family to protect, even if he had to die to ensure their future. The next 15 days blurred into a montage of bittersweet joy that felt more substantial than the last 15 years of Damon the CEO's life. They walked through the city park under gray skies, sharing a single umbrella, while the autumn rain turned the pavement into mirrors. Sophie the waitress laughed at his terrible jokes, the sound vibrant and alive, while Damon memorized the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. But the shadow was always there, growing longer with every setting sun. In the privacy of his bathroom, Damon gripped the marble sink until his knuckles turned white, biting his lip to keep from screaming as the crushing pressure in his chest threatened to collapse his ribs. He hid the tremors in his hands by keeping them deep in his pockets during their walks. He masked his shortness of breath by pausing to admire shop windows, pretending interest in displays he could not see. Every beat of his heart was a painful reminder that he was borrowing time at an exorbitant interest rate, and the debt collector was coming soon. Then came the Tuesday that shattered the illusion forever. Sophie had picked up an extra shift for a high-end catering company to pay for Toby the brother's new physical therapy sessions. The delivery address was the Aurelia Group headquarters, a glass monolith that pierced the skyline like a jagged shard of ice. She arrived at the main entrance just as a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the curb. Security guards with earpieces swarmed the sidewalk, holding back pedestrians. Sophie stopped, balancing a heavy tray of gourmet sandwiches, watching with curiosity to see which celebrity was arriving. The rear door of the lead limousine opened, and a polished leather shoe stepped onto the red carpet. Then came the suit, a charcoal masterpiece worth more than her car, and finally the face. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was Dan the drifter, but it was not Dan. The man standing there radiated power and cold authority, barking orders at a terrified assistant about stock prices. He turned, sensing eyes on him, and his gaze locked onto hers across the marble plaza. Time stopped. Damon the CEO froze, his eyes widening in pure horror as he saw the woman he loved standing in her catering uniform, clutching a tray of food. She stared at the man she thought wiped floors for a living, now realizing he owned the very pavement she stood on. The recognition was instant and devastating. The tray slipped from Sophie's numb fingers, crashing to the ground with a deafening clatter of silverware and china, the sound echoing like a gavel bringing down a guilty verdict on a liar. Damon, the CEO, shoved past his bewildered security detail, ignoring the gasps of the reception staff as he sprinted across the polished marble floor toward the woman who looked as if she had just seen a ghost. Sophie the waitress stood amidst the ruins of the gourmet sandwiches, her hands trembling violently at her sides, her eyes darting from his Italian suit to his face, piecing together the impossible betrayal. When he reached for her, pleading her name, she recoiled as if his touch were a physical blow, stumbling back into a decorative pillar. The silence in the cavernous lobby was suffocating, every eye in the Aurelia Group fixed on the spectacle of their untouchable leader begging a caterer for forgiveness. Sophie found her voice, and it was a weapon. She did not scream, which would have been easier to handle. Instead, she spoke with a cold, devastating clarity that echoed off the glass walls. She asked him if it was fun. She asked if playing poor was a hobby for him, like golf or sailing. Damon shook his head frantically, desperation clawing at his throat. He tried to explain that it was not a game, that he just wanted to know her without the weight of his money crushing the connection, that Dan the drifter was the only part of him that felt real anymore. But Sophie cut him off with a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She pointed to the spilled food, to her cheap uniform, and then to the golden logo spinning above the reception desk. She told him that, to him, poverty was a costume, a flannel shirt he could take off when it got too itchy. But for her, for Toby, it was a cage they woke up in every single day. She accused him of conducting a twisted poverty experiment, treating her struggle as a tourist attraction to make himself feel alive for a few hours before retreating to his penthouse. She brought up the $800, the scratch-off ticket. She realized now it was pocket change to him, a rounding error in his bank account, yet he had made up a story, made her cry with gratitude, made her feel indebted to a janitor when he could have written a check without blinking. She felt foolish, she felt small, she felt like a charity case that did not know it was being pitied. Damon felt the words pierce his chest deeper than his illness ever had. He stammered that he loved her, that he was trying to protect her dignity, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. Sophie stepped closer, her eyes blazing with a fierce, wounded pride. She told him that Dan the drifter was a good man, a man she could have loved, a man she did love. But Dan was dead. He never existed. Standing in front of her was just another rich man who thought people were playthings. She wiped a tear furiously from her cheek, refusing to let him see her cry one more time. She told him to stay away from her, to stay away from Toby, and to go back to his tower where he belonged. She turned on her heel, the rubber sole of her work shoe squeaking against the expensive floor, and marched toward the revolving doors. Damon watched her go, the silhouette of the only person who had made him feel human disappearing into the bright, blinding light of the afternoon sun, leaving him standing alone in the center of his empire, surrounded by millions of dollars and absolutely nothing of value. Damon, the CEO, watched the revolving doors spin, slicing the woman he loved away from him with every rotation. The silence in the lobby was deafening, a vacuum where his heart used to be. He could not let it end like this, in a misunderstanding fueled by pride and fear. A primal desperation surged through his veins, overriding the logic that had ruled his life for 40 years. He took a step, then another, his walk turning into a frantic sprint. "Sophie!" he screamed, his voice cracking, echoing off the high ceilings. His security detail lurched forward, shouting for him to wait, but he was already moving, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished marble. He needed to catch her. He needed to tell her the one truth he had held back, that he was not playing a game, he was saying goodbye. He reached the middle of the lobby, 20 feet from the exit, when the universe finally called in his debt. It did not feel like a heart attack. It felt like a demolition. A crushing weight slammed into the center of his chest, as if an invisible anvil had been dropped from the mezzanine. The air vanished from his lungs instantly. Damon stumbled, his legs turning to water. The world tilted violently to the left. He grasped at the empty air, trying to stay upright, but gravity dragged him down. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder slamming against the cold stone. Panic erupted around him, shouts for a medic, the sound of running feet, but it all sounded like it was underwater. His vision narrowed to a pinprick of light centered on the revolving door. He tried to crawl, to drag his failing body toward where she had gone, but his limbs refused to obey. He was drowning on dry land. With his final ounce of consciousness, he whispered the only name that mattered into the cold marble: Sophie. Then, the black tide rose up and swallowed him whole. Sophie, the waitress, paced the worn linoleum floor of their cramped apartment, her anger vibrating off the peeling wallpaper. She had spent the last 3 hours dissecting every interaction she had shared with Dan the drifter, reclassifying each memory from a cherished moment into a cruel deception. He was a billionaire, a tycoon, a man who could buy their entire neighborhood on a whim. She felt humiliated, exposed, and utterly foolish for believing that a man of such immense power could genuinely care about a waitress drowning in crippling debt. She ranted to the empty air, listing his betrayals, her voice rising until it cracked under the weight of her grief. Toby the brother sat quietly in his wheelchair by the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the armrest, watching his sister unravel. When she finally paused, claiming that Damon the CEO had mocked their poverty for sport, Toby spoke. His voice was soft, but it cut through her rage like a diamond cutter. He told her she was wrong. He said she was looking at the expensive suit and missing the man inside it. Sophie stopped pacing, staring at him in disbelief, asking how he could defend a liar. Toby shook his head slowly. He told her that he had known about the expensive shoes the first night Damon came to dinner. He had known the flannel shirt was a costume, but he also knew something else. He told Sophie that when they played the piano together, Damon played like a man who was running out of time. He told her that Damon was not pretending to care about them. He was pretending to be normal so that he was allowed to care. He said that in this apartment, Damon wasn't a CEO. He was just a guy who was lonely and scared, and that part wasn't a lie. The words hung heavy in the air, silencing Sophie's fury. She sank onto the sofa, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a confusing ache in her chest. She remembered the way Damon's hands shook when he held his coffee cup. She remembered the deep sadness in his eyes that no amount of smiling could hide. Was it possible that he was running from something bigger than his bank account? Before she could answer, a shrill ringing shattered the silence. It was not her phone. It was the burner phone Damon had given her for emergencies, the one he used to text her memes. She stared at it on the coffee table, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. It was 11 at night. He never called this late. She picked it up with trembling fingers. The voice on the other end was not Damon's warm baritone. It was sharp, clinical, and frantic. Dr. Aris, the specialist, introduced himself quickly, bypassing pleasantries. He asked if she was Sophie. When she confirmed, he delivered the news that brought her world crashing down. He told her that Damon had collapsed in the lobby of the Aurelia Group hours ago. He told her that Damon was in the ICU on life support. He told her the truth, that Damon had hidden so well that his heart was turning to stone, and there was nothing left to do. He said Damon was waking up for brief moments and asking for her. He said she needed to come now if she wanted to say goodbye because there would not be a tomorrow. The phone slipped from Sophie's ear. She looked at Toby, her eyes wide with terror. The wealth didn't matter. The lie didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that her Dan was dying. She grabbed her coat and ran into the night, praying to a universe she had cursed only hours ago to give her just one more chance. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open with a pneumatic hiss, sounding like a final, exhaled breath. Sophie the waitress did not wait for the nurse to announce her arrival. She rushed into the private suite, her chest heaving from the frantic sprint through the labyrinthine hospital corridors. The room was dim, lit only by the rhythmic, hypnotic flashing of cardiac monitors that painted the sterile walls in eerie shades of green and amber. In the center of the machinery lay Damon, the CEO. Stripped of his Italian charcoal suit and his humble janitor's disguise, he looked terrifyingly small against the crisp white sheets. A complex tangle of wires connected his chest to a bank of beeping computers, and a clear oxygen mask covered the lower half of his face. He looked gray, his skin translucent like parchment paper, fading into the background of the hospital linen. Sophie let out a choked, wet sob, a sound that seemed to wake him from the edge of oblivion. His eyelids fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. When he saw her standing there, a faint, trembling smile touched his pale lips. He reached a hand toward her, the fingers heavy and weak, shaking with the effort. Sophie collapsed against the metal railing of the bed, gripping his cold hand in both of hers, trying to warm him with her own life force. He pulled the oxygen mask down with a clumsy movement, his voice emerging as a rasp of broken glass. He tried to say he was sorry. He tried to explain about the lie, about the money, about wanting to be someone else for just a little while. But Sophie silenced him with a gentle finger to his lips. She told him to stop. She told him that she knew everything now. She told him that Toby the brother had explained it all to her. She understood now that he was not hiding his vast wealth from her. He was hiding his overwhelming fear. Tears slipped from the corners of his eyes, tracking slowly into his hairline. He whispered that she was the only real thing in his entire life. He said he would trade every dollar in his bank account for just one more hour in that diner with her. The confession broke the dam inside her. She disregarded the sterile environment, lowered the side rail, and climbed into the narrow bed, curling around him to hold him as he drifted away. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor became the only clock that mattered in the room, counting down seconds that felt like grains of sand slipping through an hourglass that could not be turned over. Damon, the CEO, lay still, his chest barely rising against Sophie the waitress's side. He could feel the absolute cold creeping up his extremities, a heavy numbness that started in his toes and was slowly claiming his limbs. But where his skin touched hers, there was a burning warmth that tethered him to the world of the living. He summoned every ounce of energy remaining in his failing cells to turn his head just an inch to look at her. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen, but to him, she looked like an angel of mercy who had arrived at the 11th hour to save his soul. He needed to speak. There was unfinished business that the lawyers would handle, but the emotional legacy needed to be delivered personally. He licked his dry lips and whispered her name. Sophie leaned in close, her ear hovering just above his mouth, desperate to catch every syllable. Damon gasped, the air rattling in his fluid-filled lungs. He told her that she had to listen carefully. He made her promise to take care of Toby the brother. He told her not to let the world silence that boy's music. He said that the music was the only thing that made sense in a noisy world. Sophie nodded frantically against his shoulder, sobbing that she promised that she would do anything he asked. Damon smiled weakly. He told her that she had already done the hardest thing. She had loved a man who had nothing to offer but a dying heart. He wanted to tell her about the trust fund, about the house with the garden, about the deed sitting in his lawyer's safe. But his brain was getting foggy, the words slipping away before he could form them. Instead, he distilled it down to the only truth that mattered. He whispered that she made him real. He said that for 40 years he was a ghost in a suit, but for the last 30 days he was alive. The monitor's steady rhythm skipped a beat, then another. The silence between the beeps grew longer, stretching into a terrifying pause. Damon felt the darkness closing in at the edges of his vision, soft and welcoming. He felt no fear, only a profound sense of gratitude. He squeezed Sophie's hand one last time, his strength failing. He whispered one final command, "Play the music." His eyes drifted shut. The machine let out a long, high-pitched whine that signaled the end of the line. The jagged green mountain range on the screen flattened into a relentless, unmoving horizon. Sophie froze. She waited for a breath that did not come. She waited for a squeeze that never happened. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling the scent of antiseptic and fading cologne, and let out a scream of pure, unadulterated grief that shattered the sterile peace of the hospital room. a sound of love having nowhere left to go. Damon, the CEO, was gone, leaving behind a billionaire's fortune that meant nothing, and a waitress's broken heart that meant everything. The rain fell in sheets of gray, turning the cemetery lawn into a muddy reflection of the grief drowning Sophie the waitress. It had been 3 days since the heart monitor flatlined, 3 days since the world lost a titan of industry, and she lost the gentle man in the flannel shirt. The funeral service was a surreal spectacle. Hundreds of strangers in expensive trench coats huddled under black umbrellas, exchanging business cards and whispering about market volatility, mourning a portfolio rather than a human being. Sophie stood far apart from the corporate crowd, gripping the handles of Toby the brother's wheelchair until her knuckles turned white, feeling like a trespasser in the world Damon the CEO had left behind. When the final prayer was spoken and the crowd began to disperse toward their waiting limousines, a tall man with a solemn expression and a leather briefcase approached her. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, Damon's personal attorney. He did not offer condolences. Instead, he extended a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. He told her that Damon had left strict, specific instructions that this package be delivered to her hand only after the earth had been turned over his casket. Sophie's hands trembled violently as she broke the wax seal, shielding the documents from the drizzle. Inside was not a letter, but a legal file. It was a property deed. A deed to a house in the suburbs, fully paid for, with her name printed in bold letters. Attached to it was a trust fund for Toby, containing a sum so large she had to count the zeros 3 times to comprehend it. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front page, written in shaky handwriting. It read simply, "For the music room." Sophie looked up at the lawyer, breathless, asking if this was a mistake. Mr. Sterling shook his head slowly. He told her that Damon had finalized the paperwork the very morning after he played the piano with Toby. He said Damon wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to his failing heart, hers would never have to break over money ever again. Sophie looked at the cold marble headstone, then down at the life-changing papers. Even in death, he was still her protector, saving her one last time. 6 months had dissolved into the past, taking the bitter edge of grief with them and leaving behind a soft, enduring memory that warmed the soul like the morning sun. The storefront on the corner of Elm Street was buzzing with vibrant life, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold silence of the Aurelia Group offices. Above the open door, a hand-painted wooden sign swung gently in the fresh spring breeze, reading simply Damon's Place. Inside, the atmosphere was a chaotic, happy symphony of clinking ceramic mugs, loud laughter, and the rich, inviting aroma of dark roast coffee mixed with freshly baked pastries. Sophie the waitress stood behind the polished oak counter, but she was a waitress no longer. She was an owner, a creator, and a woman who had finally found her footing on solid ground. She wore a crisp apron, not as a uniform of servitude, but as a badge of honor. She moved with a lightness that had been missing for years, greeting regulars by name and handing out free cookies to toddlers. The crushing fear of eviction, the dread of bills, the heavy weight of the world, it was all gone, washed away by the final, generous act of a dying man. But the true heart of the cafe was not the coffee or the food, it was the music. In the sunniest corner of the room, raised on a small platform built specifically for accessibility, sat a magnificent, polished baby grand piano, and seated at the bench was Toby the brother. He was no longer the shut-in hidden away in a dark apartment. He was the star. His twisted fingers danced across the ivory keys with a fluidity that defied medical explanation, pouring his soul into a jazz improvisation that captivated every patron in the crowded room. Sophie paused in her work, leaning against the espresso machine to watch him. He looked radiant, lost in the melody, safe and celebrated. Her eyes drifted to the wall above the piano. There, in a modest wooden frame, hung a photograph. It was not a professional portrait of Damon the CEO in a power suit. It was a blurry, candid selfie she had taken on a park bench, showing Dan the Drifter in his beanie and flannel shirt, laughing with his head thrown back. Sophie reached out, her fingers hovering over the glass. She whispered a quiet, heartfelt thank you to the ghost who haunted this place with benevolence. Damon had spent 40 years building an empire of cold cash, but in his final month, he had built something far more permanent. He had built a sanctuary. The music swelled to a crescendo, and Sophie smiled, knowing that as long as the piano played, he was never truly gone. If Damon's and Sophie's journey reminded you that the truest wealth isn't what's in your bank account, but who is holding your hand at the end, please honor his legacy by hitting that like button. We would love to hear your voice in the comments. If you had only 30 days left to live, how would you spend them? Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to join our community of storytellers. And please, share this video with someone you love today, because as we learned from Dan the Drifter, we never know how much time we have left to say the things that really matter. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.